right, Psalm 25, let's call this one the path to friendship. In this psalm that reminded me of an old school preacher tool called, sometimes I guess called the rule of threes, which means that some sermons offer you 3 points and an invitation. And this one reminded me of the 3 P's, which are patience, pardon, and his paths, which is the recurring theme from this set of 7 chapters that we're looking at this week, as the first part of the psalm talks about the famous statement, "Unto you, O Lord, do I lift up my soul." We ask God not to let his enemies triumph over him. And the waiting comes in verse 3 where it says, "Indeed, none who wait for you shall be put to shame." It's going to talk about waiting at least 3 times, understanding that in the first 28 psalms that we've seen, or by the end of this week, we will have seen so far, waiting is a recurrent theme that goes along with that whole concept of taking refuge in God, as opposed to times when I can get what I want by my own power, but I can't necessarily do it and maintain my integrity. Once again, David is going to combine both of those terms, meaning by the end, he's going to say, God is my refuge, but taking refuge in God often requires us to have that first P, and that is patience, as he has said in verse 3. None who wait on you will ultimately be ashamed. But he is going to go on to talk about the paths around about verse 4, where he says, "Make me to know your ways, O Lord. Teach me your paths. Lead me in your truth and teach me, for you are the God of my salvation. For you I," once again, "wait all day long." At which point we will get to the whole part about the pardon, where round about verse 6, he's going to say, "Remember mercy, O God, but not so much the sins of my youth." Understanding that David is the kind of man who can say that he has put some distance between who he is now and the sins of his youth. He is not asking God for a pass on the things that he has consistently carried over into his now. He is asking God for a pardon for the things that he has consciously tried to put in his past. As he goes on to say in verse 11, "For your name's sake, O Lord, pardon my guilt, for it is great." Understanding that it takes a level of humility to confess not only the fact that we've done things wrong, but we've probably done some pretty significant wrongs in our day. He's going to go on then to talk more about the kind of person that God is willing to work with, as he goes on again to ask God to be gracious to him because he takes refuge in God. And David, once again, is not simply a man concerned about his own interest. He's going to conclude by asking God to redeem Israel in general. But in giving us more detail about the kinds of people that God is willing to work with, he reminded me of something I heard just in my short drive this week from another more famous preacher by the name of J.D. Greear, who talked about Solomon and the 2 kinds of wisdom that he actually got from God. One that had to do more with understanding right from wrong, another that had to do with developing his natural understanding for the kinds of things that God wanted him to do. Something that reminded me a lot of what we see in verses 12 and 14 here, where they say, "Who is the man who fears the Lord? Him will he instruct in the way he should choose." Verse 14, though, "The friendship of the Lord is for those who fear him, and he makes known to them his covenant." A footnote I have on friendship is the secret counsel. And what Mr. J.D. Greear helped me understand was there is a level of discernment that's much like what we see in Hebrews, where he says that it is through constant practice that we develop the ability to discern good from evil. But there is another component of wisdom that is more akin to the friendship of God, and that is not an honor that the word hands out lightly or often. Understanding that some of the instances that come to mind for me are Abraham, who was, I think, called a friend of God, Moses, who, when he was challenged by Miriam and Aaron, his own kin, God said, "Why were you not afraid to challenge Moses in this way?" Understanding that I talk to him face to face as a man talks to his friend. And David, being a man after God's own heart, had a son, Solomon, known for being the wisest man of his day, prophesied or foretold by God to be someone who God would counsel as a son. And so, as we mentioned before, Israel had many kings, but it did not have many leaders described as friends of God. And why is that important? Well, it may not be, but this week it caught my attention because I have been blessed to know some people who, growing up, we were just buddies, but now there's some pretty successful folks. And out of all of the successful people I know, some of them have an uncommon level of wisdom that doesn't come from my friendship, but it seems to be a natural derivative of some of the things I got to see as they were growing up in families where they might not have had rich heritage, but they did have family members who seemed to value a friendship with God. And much like Jesus says, you will know a tree by its fruit. They were people who evidenced an uncommon wisdom that suggests they developed an actual friendship with God in much the same way that their children are now successful and wise in a way that suggests they've likewise valued developing a friendship with God. The kind of relationship that can develop when we become so familiar with his ways that we begin to pick up on even the subtle ways he chooses to counsel his people.